We're delighted to have the distinguished historian, Dr. Frederick Hoxie, with us today. He's going to be talking about his new book, This Indian Country, American Indian Activists and the Place They Made. And we're in for a treat. The Washingtonians among us, I thought I'd give us a quote from the Bancroft Prize-winning historian James Merrill, who said about Fred Hoxie's book, "In this remarkable book, Frederick Hoxie portrays men and women whose weapons were words and whose battlegrounds were courtrooms, congressional hearings, newspapers, and lecture halls. With ingenuity and tenacity, these Native American activists learned to navigate the corridors of U.S. power in Washington, D.C., a wilderness surely as daunting as any on the continent." And in fact, right next door, we have an adopted son of the Crow Nation just about to be inaugurated as President of the United States. Dr. Hoxie is Swanland Professor of History at the University of Illinois, also a Professor of Law. He's the author of a number of books, winner of awards, including the 2012 Lifetime Achievement Award in American Indian History. He's also a founding trustee of this museum who's done distinguished service for us. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off so we can all enjoy the program we're webcasting, and welcome to our virtual audience also. After Dr. Hoxie's presentation, we can take questions. There will be a microphone set up at the back of the center aisle. Also, we're going to have a book signing right after Dr. Hoxie's presentation in the lobby of the theater. His book will be available for sale, and Dr. Hoxie will be signing books. It's an excellent, excellent book. Now let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Frederick Hoxie. Fred, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everyone for coming out on what seems to a Chicagoan anyway to be a kind of a warm day and a beautiful, at least it got sunny out there. It's really a delight to be here. I became a trustee of this museum in 1990. There was no director, there was no building, there was no architect, there was an idea, and that idea is real around us, and it's kind of an amazing thing still for me to walk into this space and to think about its origins and to think about the hundreds and hundreds of people who worked to make it real. It's also remarkable to think about this building where it is, the context for this building. Someone said that historians are in the context business, so I can't resist a little bit of context. To think about a monument down the mall to a man who referred to American Indians as wolves, George Washington. We just took a walk a little while ago and walked past a statue of John Marshall, who wrote the word savages about Indians in the early 19th century. And to think about this place and about what it represents and its position in a society that never imagined that American Indian people would survive, no less be present and vital and participating important members of the American community. Darcy McNichol, one of the figures I talk about in this book, said many years ago, ideas are things that can't be crushed like an eggshell. And I think that one explanation for how we got to where we are today, which is another thing historians love to try to do anyway, is that there were ideas brought into this community of the United States, just like the idea of a National Museum of the American Indian, that generated change and that could not be crushed. Now I realize that change, I'm a professor, so I think ideas change the world, and I realize that doesn't always happen, but powerful new ideas, can change the world and can change societies. And essentially my book is about three ideas that the founders and the founding generation and the settlers who came here from Europe never imagined would become a part of the American creed. And those ideas are, first, that treaties communicate rights to people, that a treaty is something that contains mutual obligations, and therefore the treaty-making powers have the right to, let's say, water and land and other elements of that treaty, and so it can be enforced. The treaty isn't a charade, the treaty isn't a flourish, a rhetorical flourish, it's a real agreement, it's like a contract. So there are treaty rights, not just a Bill of Rights and so on in our Constitution, there's something called treaty rights. Another idea is that tribal communities can and should live as autonomous communities, political entities within the United States. That tribes, groups of people, have just as much right to live in ways they choose and with whom they choose as do the citizens of Chicago, where I live, or of Peoria, Illinois, or of any other community in the country. And third, that people can be members of a native community, members of a tribe, and be citizens of the United States, that they can be both things at once. Now, those are three powerful ideas. And those ideas were not ideas conceived by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or any of the other array of founders. Those were Indian ideas. And those were ideas that Indian people articulated, imagined, and argued for over a 200-year period. So this is the way I have viewed Native history, thanks to teachers that I've had along the way. It's not the view of Native history that most people absorb. I was lucky. One of my early teachers was the anthropologist Alfonso Ortiz from San Juan. And he said to me before I first visited a Native community, he said, "You're going to meet a lot of important people, but don't pay much attention to the offices. Look in the community to see who has kept that community alive. Who represents the thread that you can trace from the present to the past. Those aren't necessarily the people who have the titles and the offices and all the other trappings of office." And I found that was a very interesting piece of advice, because as I worked with Indian communities, with Indian people face to face, but also as I met Indian people in the archives, in the records, many of which are in this city, I found these people who were not supposed to be there. I found people who were remarkably tenacious, disruptive. They were a real pain to the government administrators who wanted all things to work in certain ways. And I found that those were the people very often that kept communities alive and that kept that thread moving into the future. I think about those people because and it really inspired me to take on an exercise that I use whenever I teach American Indian history to undergraduates, and I describe this experience in the introduction of my book, where I talk about on the first day of class. One of the things I've learned is that students will do anything on the first day of class. You can ask them to do any crazy thing and they'll usually cooperate with you. So I ask students to take out a piece of paper and write down the names of 3 Indians, just the first 3 names that come to mind. I started doing this years ago, and I don't exactly know why, but I've been fascinated to do it over the decades because the answer is always the same. It used to be 3, now it's 4, thanks to Walt Disney. Crazy Horse, Geronimo, Sitting Bull, Pocahontas sneaks in there every now and then. And so I asked the students, this is not a quiz, this is not show you that I'm smarter than you are, this is a way of inventorying, what does this society teach you? You walk into a class, what do you already have in your head about American Indians? And what does that say about what the society is teaching us about the history of Native people? And my conclusion is that what society is teaching about Native people is that their history is over, that history is short, and that history is sad. Now, the point of this is not to denigrate great warriors or Pocahontas or anyone else, but to say that there's a great deal more, and part of my reason for doing this in the first day of class is kind of a teaser for what's to come, hopefully something more complicated than what they've known before. But the point is that what society teaches is that Native people are important only in relationship to American expansion, either as helpers, Pocahontas, or as opponents. And once the process of American expansion is over, Indian history is over. Now, from what I've already said, you can see that that view of history doesn't help us explain where we are very much. That view of history doesn't help us understand those three important ideas generated by Indian people. It doesn't really help us see the humanity of American Indian people and of communities across time. So as I've done this exercise, as I've taught, as I've sort of ruminated over these things, it seemed to me it would be great to try to write a book about those people, those unexpected, complicated, obstreperous people who kept arguing with the people who were trying to administer them and trying to get them to believe things about themselves that they knew really were not true. So I began really compiling in my mind a kind of an all-star team of activists, of people who I thought might illustrate this theme. I was inspired in part of this by a discovery I made at the National Archives many years ago, just down the street here. I came across a file of correspondence between the Crow Tribal Council and the secretary, the chief clerk in the Office of Indian Affairs. And the chief clerk wrote a letter to the business committee. This is Robert Yellowtail was a young leader of the Crows at this time. He wrote a letter to the business committee and he said, "You are not allowed to have a tribal attorney. We understand you've tried to hire an attorney. You're not allowed to do that. You can't do that without the approval of this office." And the letter back in this dusty file was, "If you have concerns, please take them up with our attorney. He's in Washington and this is his number." I thought, this is someone I'd like to know more about. I'd like to know where this person came from. So this was my idea, and what I've done is I've tried to construct a book around a succession of people who are involved in this question of how are American Indians to survive in the United States? What would it take to make life viable for Indian people in the United States? This is a question that begins really at the very beginning. American Indians were horrified, perplexed, aghast when they learned that in Paris, the European powers had agreed to place the western boundary of the United States at the Mississippi River. There were no American settlements west of the Appalachians. The vast majority of that area was Indian country. And so they were immediately faced with this perplexing fact that they were living in a country that was formally recognized as being the United States of America, in which they had no role and they had no place. Well, the first confrontation over this kind of question that takes place off the battlefield, and none of this is to say that people on the battlefield didn't make an important contribution, but I think we need to understand some other elements of Native history as well beyond the battlefield. And so the first major discussion, debate over this question off the battlefield happened in the Southeast in the early 1810s and 20s following the War of 1812, when young rising politicians like Andrew Jackson concluded that Indian people needed to get out. And he said it pretty much that bluntly. Many of them, to many Native leaders who had been his comrades in arms just a few years earlier fighting the British. But at any rate, in this context, in the early 19th century, there emerges the first of my activists, a man named James MacDonald, who I call the first Indian lawyer. And I've been traveling around the country saying the first Indian lawyer, hoping someone will challenge me if there's an earlier one, but I so far haven't found one. James MacDonald was born in 1801, and he really is the first person to articulate this issue of treaty rights and some of these beginning ideas. He lives a short life, but it's a remarkable life. He was educated first in mission schools in Mississippi, then he came to Baltimore. The Society of Friends in Baltimore supported him. He became a clerk in the Indian office, and through his contacts with the Indian office people, and even with the Secretary of War, John Calhoun, he was introduced to a lawyer, and he read for the law, which is how people became lawyers in the 19th century. And he became a lawyer. He returns to Mississippi in 1824, just when this demand from Andrew Jackson, who is at this point doesn't hold office, but is a very powerful figure, is coming into focus. And is asked to accompany a tribal delegation coming to Washington to negotiate a new treaty. So James MacDonald really is the first Indian lawyer in the sense that he comes to Washington with a delegation of elders, men a generation older than he, and begins to function as an attorney. He drafts proposals. He gets them back. He goes to visit in the office. He records what the government's positions are. He comes back. He acts as the clerk and secretary and so on. And this is really the first kind of formal negotiation that begins to take place. But think about that setting. The assumption of these people is not, oh, we have to get out, okay. No, the assumption is we will negotiate this as communities. We will find some way of understanding each other. In the midst of this process, in December of 1824, Pushmataha, who was the chief negotiator, the elder of the group, dies here in Washington, D.C. Suddenly, MacDonald effectively becomes the chair of the delegation, and he conducts the rest of the negotiations. But the most interesting thing, and I think what's significant in the arc of my story about James MacDonald, is before they leave Washington, after they've concluded their treaty, he writes a memorial to Congress, which I discussed in the chapter on him. But what it says in simple terms is, he says, you are people of the law, and you are people who believe in civilization. Therefore, we know you will respect our rights. So he's very interesting, very subtly placing himself inside the American community. He's not the outsider. He's not someone who's going to be pushed out. He's someone who says, well, I'm here too. We believe in the law, and we believe in rights, therefore I have rights. In many ways, this memorial is the first shot of what eventually becomes federal Indian law. We know federal Indian law is a very imperfect structure, as others of my figures would say, but nevertheless, this is an important moment. And so I have tried to construct stories that build on this insight about MacDonald. I have another chapter that follows it on William Potter Ross, who was John Ross's nephew, who takes over as Cherokee chief after Ross's death and becomes the sort of leading advocate of Indian nationalism in the middle of the 19th century. William Potter Ross says at one point in a speech in Oklahoma, then Indian Territory, he says, why can't we be like San Marino? I read this line in the library in Norman, Oklahoma, and I thought, San Marino? What is he talking about? I remember as a kid I collected stamps, and there were these really cool San Marino stamps. That's about all I knew. Well, what I learned was what William Potter Ross knew very well, which is San Marino is a principality within the then consolidating nation of Italy that negotiated an autonomous status for itself within that nation state. Well, I could say more about William Potter Ross, but he continues this query, this question about Indian political identity, about Indian sovereignty within the boundaries of the United States. But this question, these kinds of concerns are happening in other parts of the country as well. I then leap out and talk about Sarah Winnemucca from Nevada. Sarah Winnemucca, whose statue is in the Capitol and Statuary Hall. She's one of the Nevada statues, but I don't think really appreciated for what a remarkable person she was. She was born literally in the middle of what is now an interstate that runs through Nevada into California and was the trail that the gold rush followed. And she was born in the 1840s, and she grew up in the whirlwind of the gold rush and all of the changes that took place around it and the tremendous environmental destruction, all the things that happened. She learned English, and she became a translator at Indian agencies. And as someone sitting up close and translating, interpreting, she saw very clearly the kind of brutality that was taking place with relationships between settlers and the government. And she began to talk about American expansion, but not in a way that the government or the public was terribly interested in at the time. This was the age when they were painting those wall-size Bierstadt and other paintings about the West and how beautiful it was and about how America's destiny was to conquer the West and that was a good thing. And Sarah Winnemucca said this process is not the apogee of civilization. This process is violent. It's destructive. It's particularly violent against women. It destroys the environment. It is a cruel process, an unfair process. Sarah Winnemucca was a remarkable character, and there are descriptions of her in newspapers and in letters of her. She was tremendously stylish. She loved to wear the latest fashions and so on. She would ride in parades and so on. She was not to be denied, and she was not to be dismissed. So when she fell out of favor, which she soon did with the Indian office, she took to the lecture circuit. So we're now in the 1870s and 80s, particularly for women, is a time of political activism. And Sarah Winnemucca makes common cause with a group of women's rights activists in Boston. She goes to Boston. She lives with a couple of women who were active in the women's rights movement, and they persuade her to take her lectures, which she's been giving, and write them down. And in a very short order, she writes and publishes, with the help of these women reformers, Life Among the Paiutes, the first autobiography written by an American Indian woman, which describes the process of westward expansion. And rather than the golden slopes and all of that kind of optimistic view of the West, she begins the book by saying they came like a lion, like a roaring lion, and they have continued ever since. So her image of the West, of a westward settlement, was the invasion of lions. So she traveled the country and she brought this new question before the American public. How do Americans justify this kind of action? How can Americans justify this kind of cruelty? She had a trope in her lectures, or a moment in her lectures, where she would be talking about things that had happened, about warfare and violence and so on, and then she would stop and she would step away. Often she would lecture in native costume, and people would think they were getting a kind of feel-good, visit to Paiute land and so on, and she would stop and step back and say, and how can you, the sons and daughters of the Pilgrims, how can you, who call yourselves Christians, how can you live up to this? So aside from the kind of legal story that's going on in one part of the country, there is this kind of rhetorical and emotional and moral argument that's being made in other parts of the country. These things begin to come together in the end of the 19th century. And I write a chapter, which I'm not going to sort of summarize everything, but I write a chapter about the Court of Claims, which becomes a vehicle for Indian people. This is a court that the United States sets up so that people who have claims against it for not paying their bills or for some kind of injury can enter into it. Congress said, when they set up the Court of Claims, that Indians could not come in. This reminds us of some of the recent debates in the UN and so on, where people are, afraid of being sued. So when they set up the Court of Claims, they're not going to start having Indians suing them. So they said Indians could only sue if they got the permission of Congress to file a lawsuit. Well, what's very interesting to watch, if you sort of follow the records, is that this process begins in the 1880s. The first tribes get the permission of Congress. They lobby Congress, and they begin to file suits in the Court of Claims. And it begins in Oklahoma, but then it begins to move into the Midwest. It moves into the Great Lakes. And by the 1920s, tribes all over the United States are filing suits, are going through this process of bringing suit against the United States. Now, this is an exercise in recognition, in a sense. This is people who are demanding to be heard. And one of the ways of looking at these cases is to say, well, they didn't get paid very much, and it really didn't return land, and it was a very imperfect method. But what it did do, again, this idea of keeping the community alive, it was a way of rallying, of organizing the community, of making its case before the public, and of making political progress, not just financial progress. So I have a chapter about the Mille Lacs Ojibways and their remarkable story of their victory in the U.S. Court of Claims in 1911. So the story begins to have sort of this moral as well as political quality, and then we come, in the 20th century, the paths begin to cross in Washington, D.C. And someone once said to me when I was starting the book, is this going to be a book just about lawyers? And I said, no, I hope not. I'm going to try to do that. And the other one, is this going to be just a book about Washington? I said, well, I hope not. But there's a remarkable story of people's paths crossing in Washington and people learning from each other, hearing about each other. There's a great description of William Potter Ross testifying before a Senate committee about Cherokee nationalism, Cherokee sovereignty in the 1880s. And the newspaper report in the Indian Territory newspaper says There were several delegations from the West who were also present. William Potter Ross went to Princeton. He spoke the language of the senators. It's fascinating to think about him making those arguments in the presence of people from other parts of the country. Well, it's very hard to track some of those things. I've done a little of it. But the person who really kind of brings it together and brings it visibly to the surface in the early 20th century is a man named Thomas Sloan, who's in Omaha. And he sets up a law practice in Washington, D.C. in about 1910, 1915. It's hard to know exactly when he moves from Nebraska, where he was practicing law, into Washington full-time. But by World War I, he is here full-time, and he is acting as an Indian lawyer. He's taking all comers. He's representing tribes before the Indian office. He's speaking for them before committees. There are hearings, you read hearings, and they say, oh, here's Thomas Sloan again. He says, yes, I'm here again, and I'm representing the Lummies. Here I'm representing the Blackfeet. I'm representing different groups. So he begins to pull these different threads together, and by watching his career, we can see this happening, all against the wishes of the Indian office, all a kind of nightmare for the administrators who are leading this. Thomas Sloan became a lawyer because he, sort of in the same way as Sarah Winnemucca became an activist, he was a herdsman on the Omaha reservation. He was a young Indian kid who was employed by the Indian office to take care of the cattle. And he was a bright guy, and he began to say, well, whose cattle are these? And are they paying rent for this? And he began to find out that it was one of these sweetheart deals between the agent and the local white cattleman and so on. And he began to complain about this or ask questions about it. Before you know it, he was on a train to Hampton Institute. They sent him off to boarding school to get rid of it. He was a star student. He came back. He still had the same questions he had when he left. I don't know what they were thinking. They thought they'd get rid of him. I guess that agent was gone. It was the short-term solution to the problem. He came back, saw the same kind of thing, and read law in a local law office, and actually became quite a distinguished lawyer in Nebraska before he moved here. He's also the first Indian lawyer to argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1905. So Sloan's career starts about, in Washington anyway, starts about World War I and runs into the 1930s. He dies just on the eve of World War II. My next bridge is the generation of people who came of age during the New Deal. And here again, my goal in this book is to try to understand more deeply the world of American Indian people, not the world of white policymakers, not the world of law professors or of white judges. And in looking at it more deeply, what I've discovered is that there was a generation of people who were able to speak much more fully, much more vocally, and much more aggressively in the 1940s and 50s because they had had the opportunity of the new policy changes that had taken place in the 1930s. But this is not a story about John Collier. This is not a story about white policymakers, but it's a story about this community of people who came of age, really, in this time period. And the remarkable event where this generation really reaches its peak, at least in my opinion, is not only the founding of the National Congress of American Indians in 1944, an organization which we all know is a very important one and a real presence in Washington today, but a conference which they held in 1954 here in Washington, an emergency conference which was called in a matter of weeks to stop the worst offenses of termination, which were attempting to be implemented in the beginning of 1954. They hold a national conference. They have over 180 tribal representatives from all over the country, and Indian people are speaking with a unified voice about termination. And again, the argument is we have treaty rights, we have the right to have our own communities, we have the right to live as we want to live, not to be terminated, and we have the right to be Indian as well as citizens of the United States. My final chapter is about Vine Deloria. In many ways, the hardest one to write because he was my colleague on the board here, someone I had known for many years. He was a remarkable man. I'm sure several people in the room here knew him, and so I won't try to summarize, except to say that he wrestled with this question of where do American Indians fit into the United States? And his answer was always, they don't fit so neatly. American Indians are not American racial minority. American Indians are a distinct group of people, distinct sovereign people whose life is led within the boundaries of the United States. At the same time, they are people with a special history, a special set of values, which have something to contribute to the people of the United States. So he was a complicated person. He was a person who had critics, me among them, but also admirers, and I was also one of those. And he never had simple answers for questions, but he insisted, and the title of the chapter is Indian Americans or American Indians. And this was the question of the 60s and 70s that he wrestled with. And his answer was always American Indians, a distinctive group of people with a distinctive set of values and political claims on the United States. So writing this book gave me a chance to sort of focus on my all-star team of people and to discover these people and really to sort of try to show in 3 dimensions how people wrestled with these questions over the last 200 years. But as I assembled this book, I also discovered something that I really, frankly, didn't think I was going to find when I started. And that is that there was a thread, there's a connection between these people. And that connection was in those ideas about sovereignty, about the rights of people to their own culture, and about the ability of American citizenship to embrace Indian people as well as non-Indian people. Ultimately, what all of these people were concerned about was about humanity, was about recognizing the humanity of Indian people as fellow travelers in the United States. I'll just read you the last paragraph to give you an idea of where I ended, and then we can have some questions. Almost from the start, Indian activists had wanted American officials and legislators and all their citizens to appreciate that the nation could represent much more than a beautiful territory that had been wrested from the grasp of its original inhabitants. By recognizing and defending the rights of Native people to occupy and maintain their own homelands within the national landscape, American leaders could finally embrace the humanity of Native people and the undeniable truth that Indians did not exist out there or back then, but instead that they were and had always been fellow travelers on the American journey. Discovering the legacy of American Indian activists opens a doorway then to the discovery of a new place, this Indian country. Thank you. I'm happy to take any comments or questions. Yes? We have a microphone for the web.
We're webcasting, so if you don't mind, thank you very much.
When you talk about the treaties and Indian rights, do the treaties also have obligations for both the Indians and the government in which they exist?
Absolutely.
And so these activists, were they trying to get the obligations enforced as well as their own rights? And secondly, you say American Indian, does that include Ecuadorian American Indians or just
well,
U.S.?
My book is really about the United
U.S.
States.
Indians.
Yeah. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, they saw this as an agreement. That's part of what treaties represented for Indian people, is that they were human agreements between people. So there were obligations and there were rights that were communicated. Okay.
Yes, hi. My question sort of deals with going back to the 1880s and the legislative process that was going on with the treaties, but also the political resistance that was going on with the Western tribes, and then currently, with the American Indian movement, and even now with Idle No More in Canada. There seems to be a resurgence of not just legislative challenges between the Harper government and, say, the United States, but also in the larger act of sovereignty as an issue of political resistance. Could you talk more about that?
Yes, I guess one disclaimer that I would make is that while I think these are remarkable people, and this is a remarkable American story, this is not a story that's over. And it is not a story, this is not a Pollyanna version that everything is great in Indian country because these activists made these contributions and so on. What I think this contribution represents is the recognition of Indian people as part of the American political community, which by pointing out the Washington Monument and so on, I wanted to underscore that this was not imagined by the nation's founders. But throughout this process, people like Sarah Winnemucca, who was certainly idle no more, and others have taken a variety of tactics to accomplish their ends. And so this is something that it's unstable. I think one of the images of Indian law and policy that I have always liked is in Phil Frickie's casebook on American Indian law. He says American Indian law is a structure which rests on a foundation of colonialism. So at the very bottom of American Indian law is essentially a colonial relationship, which is a non-consensual relationship. So it's inherently unstable. There's I don't know how many of you have read Louise Erdrichs' new book, The Roundhouse, but in it she has a fabulous image, similar image of American Indian law, where this tribal court judge is explaining to his son what's American Indian law, and they have a rotted casserole in the kitchen, that they find in the back of the refrigerator. And he turns it upside down and he says, "This is Indian law." He said, "I try to place forks and knives," and he starts playing with it on the stage. He says, "I'm trying to build a rational structure on it, but the foundation is pretty bad." So that instability is what I think will always produce activism and will always produce dissent. And I think that's why, while I wanted to end with Vine Deloria, you'll see that my portrait of him is not someone who had all the answers, but rather that someone who articulated really the fundamental issues and questions that we have to face. I'm not sure if that answered. Okay.
What are some of the obligations that have not been fulfilled, or what the activists were working on?
Well, I guess we have to maybe speak in specifics. I'm not quite sure. Well, there are hundreds of treaties, so I can't recite them. To live in peace was one obligation that people had, to respect the boundaries of a reservation, to protect it, and so on. These are elements of a treaty. Well, if you take the Cherokees, for example, not so much. They passed the Stevens Act, which eradicated the treaties that had guaranteed them their homeland in Oklahoma. So that was a violation, I suppose you could say, of the obligations that were embedded in the original. So this is an imperfect process, these treaties, but the effort of these activists is to force recognition that these treaties did involve obligations, and that these treaties were being made with living communities, with fellow human beings, and that they needed to be adjudicated. And the problem with federal Indian law is that this is a moving target. It's not a simple kind of question, not a simple calculation. One of the things I've learned teaching federal Indian law to law students is it drives them crazy. But I always say it's better to teach you to drive you crazy now than later, because all the rules change. All the rules can be revised. All the rules can be altered later on, because a lot of these obligations were violated, and because a lot of the agreements were then politicized and changed. And
so there was a book written several years ago called Black Hills, White Justice.
Yes.
And I think his name was Ralph Chase, was litigating for the case.
Yeah.
In his work, supposedly that was the longest held litigation for the Pahasapa, the Black Hills, and the United States government. Is that still litigation still currently in process?
We got lawyers here who can answer that question. There is a cash award that has not been accepted. So you could say yes, it is in process, but I think the legal proceedings ended in the Supreme Court in 1980, but the proceeding of how to implement that agreement is open. And the deeper question, the political question of how is this to be resolved is, again, it's another one of these imperfect moments that will remain to be worked on. But I guess my view, and I guess, again, to put a pitch in for this institution, this is a place where people can raise questions and talk about ideas and to try to shape this future. It's going to take a long time. Hi.
Hi. I guess my question is, do all the people that you focus on in your book really share the language of nation and nationhood? Do they all believe in the concept of tribal nations? And
No.
And do they use that word?
No. This is just as Americans, U.S. citizens carrying passports from 1780 to 2012 or 13 don't share the same notion of what the American nation is and what it represents and who you have to be a part of the nation. But there's some very interesting variations in all of this. The chapter on Thomas Sloan is called the Good Citizenship Gun. Thomas Sloan was he was in Omaha, and he was a part of the Omaha community, but he was a real advocate of what many Indian leaders of his day were, of abolishing the Indian office and of having all Indians become U.S. citizens. They were not citizens, as you know, until 1924. And so you could look at him and say, well, this guy's an assimilationist. He's not an Indian. He's not an Indian advocate. And yet, why is he in favor of citizenship? He's in favor of citizenship because you can then go to court and enforce your treaty rights. You can enforce the obligations that the federal government has for you. So I think you have to sort of take these in there, again, use the word context. You have to take them in their moment, and there is a shifting definition of these terms. I gave a talk about this book in Chicago a few months ago, and Susan Power, who some of you may know is an elder in the Chicago community, was there, and someone asked a similar question, and we were saying, well, what makes these people activists and so on? And I'm not sure if I can define the term. It was sort of the best one I could come up with. But she said there are people, they were leaders who loved their people. And I think as broad and fuzzy as that is, I think that's what Sloan was. Sloan had, when people would press him and say, well, you're part white, and you're a lawyer, and you live in Washington, you're not really an Indian. And he'd say, I've been treated like an Indian in my life. I was put in jail by my agent. I was sent to boarding school. I think I am. So, but it's a good question. I think maybe some people have a different opinion of it, but that's my story.
Well, welcome to the meeting. Am I on? Right. I'm wondering how you considered Alexander MacGillivray and his incredible skill, writing 30 and 40-page letters to 3 and 4 nations at the same time. I just think he's a profound person in that category.
Yeah. Well, it's not a planted question, but chapter 1 is called Erased from the Map. And a lot of this, I conceived and wrote this book for a general audience. I sometimes wonder that's a hard thing to try to do, but I tried to write a very broad book. I very much wanted to sort of talk about these big ideas. But I wanted to begin with this remarkable fact that the American nation had boundaries established at the very beginning that had nothing to do with American settlement, which most Americans don't quite get their heads around. And so I framed the first chapter with a story of what's going on in Paris and how Ben Franklin and the Americans sort of maneuvered the British around to accept these boundaries, which the French and the Spanish, by the way, were horrified by. The Spanish wanted the western boundary to be somewhere around Nashville. They thought that was a reasonable western boundary for the United States. The rest, they said, was Indian country. At any rate, so I frame it around that story, and then Joseph Brant in the north and Alexander MacGillivray in the south, both warriors for the British, both important military allies of the British who considered themselves leaders of independent nations who were going to be recognized at the end of the war and who were sold out by the British and by the Spanish. That's sort of my framing story. They're the people. They're the witnesses to the creation of this new country that erased them from the map. But there's a lot more to be said about him. That's how I treat it. Yeah. What's that? What about? Sure.
My name's Mike Hermany Horses. I'm from Wounded Knee, visiting. You ask about the Black Hills. A legislative movement was put together in 1983 to have the hills, the federal portions, returned to us, about 2.7 out of the 7.7 million acres. And I'm personal friends with Bill Bradley, who was a senator from New Jersey. I talked the senator into introducing the legislation here during the Reagan years, when states' rights was a big issue here in the country. We gathered our people, the Sioux tribes involved, behind it. The government sent saboteurs in among us to sabotage it. So we went from 83 to basically about 87 with the hopes that, you know, the Congress would deal with us in a fair way. We were amazed about the amount of ignorance and bigotry in this country. They told us, we gave you that land, and we took it back because it had resources. You people are unproductive. You don't want to mine. You don't want to do all these things. Our philosophy is to live with the land in balance. It's hard for people to understand that. And the money was awarded was $100 million after attorneys who had no legal contracts with us took their 10%, washed their hands of it. So we floundered for a number of years until we came up with this alternative. And as I said, they sent some saboteurs in and got us to fighting, and Sioux people love to fight. I mean, there's a couple in here. My friend Kevin's over here. He knows that. He's Pawnee, you know. We have a long shared history fighting. And so the award has grown to over, with interest, to about 1.6 billion. We don't even know if it's there. Look at Cobell, how they managed our resources. They may be nothing there. We don't know. We haven't asked for it. But more importantly, Black Hills are being destroyed as we speak with pine beetle infestation. 60% of the forest is gone. The rest is dying. So I think when it's a big rock denuded of its force, they'll probably give it back to us. Okay? So that's the quick answer.
Maybe one more question and then we need to end.
With the I Don't Know More movement spreading throughout Canada with the First Nations, now into America, and has recently spread across the world, what's your thoughts on the I Don't Know More movement and where it's going?
My thoughts are that it sounds like from what I know of it, it sounds like a very positive development. It's a place that brings Indian people and Indian voices forward and demanding recognition and not game playing and sabotage, but negotiations and the recognition of mutual humanity. And I think that's a worthy goal. But I mean, everything's happening so fast, I can't pretend to be an expert on what's going on.
I think that we have to close now. We have another program after this, and we'd like to have time for the book signing outside with Dr. Hoxie. So can we please give a warm thank you to Dr. Hoxie?
Thank you.